The dark truth behind how World War II started. Full-color documentary. November 1st, 1939. German tanks rolled deep into Polish territory, crushing all resistance. The world watches in horror as Hitler's war machine tears through Europe. We've been told this was about ideology, about madness, about a dictator's insane ambitions. But that's the surface story. Here's the truth nobody wants you to hear. World War II didn't start because of hatred or nationalism. It started because of a balance sheet. It started because Germany went bankrupt in 1923, and the men who rebuilt it understood one simple truth. Sovereignty is solvency. This isn't a story about armies. This is a story about the ledger. Go back to November 11th, 1918. The First World War ends at exactly 11 a.m. 4 years of slaughter come to a halt. The German Empire collapses. Kaiser Wilhelm flees to Holland like a coward. German soldiers march home defeated, starving, humiliated. But here's what matters. They didn't lose on the battlefield. They lost because the money ran out. The German treasury was empty. The gold reserves were gone. The credit lines were frozen. Britain and France kept fighting because American banks kept lending. Germany stopped fighting because the ledger said no. Picture Germany before the war. Magnificent industrial cities. Steel mills pumping out machinery. Railways connecting a vast empire. Berlin glowing with electric lights and grand boulevards. The German mark was respected worldwide. German engineering was the gold standard. This was the second most powerful economy on earth. Wealth flowed like rivers of molten gold through Frankfurt and Hamburg. The Kaiser's armies marched with the confidence of men backed by endless resources. Or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Germany's war machine ran on borrowed time and borrowed money. Every shell fired, every ship built, every soldier fed, required cash that Germany increasingly didn't have. The British naval blockade strangled German trade. No exports meant no foreign currency. No foreign currency meant no way to buy food or raw materials from neutral countries. By 1918, German civilians were eating sawdust bread and boiling leather for soup. The economy wasn't just struggling. It was bleeding out on an operating table with no surgeon in sight. Then came Versailles, June 28, 1919. The treaty that would poison Europe for a generation. Article 231 declared Germany guilty of starting the war. That wasn't just moral judgment. That was the legal justification for what came next. Reparations, massive, crushing, unending reparations. Germany would pay for the entire war. Every destroyed French farm. Every dead British soldier. Every Belgian factory reduced to rubble. The bill came to 132 billion gold marks. Let that number sink in. That's roughly $442 billion in today's money, and Germany's entire GDP in 1919 was barely a fraction of that. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't a peace agreement. It was a foreclosure notice. Germany lost territory that generated 15% of its agricultural production and 10% of its industrial capacity. The Saar coal fields went to France for 15 years. Upper Silesia, another industrial heartbeat, was carved away to Poland. The Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany's industrial core defenseless. Overseas colonies were liquidated and distributed like auction items. Germany's merchant fleet was seized. Its patents were confiscated and sold. This wasn't punishment. This was asset stripping. And then came the addiction. Germany had no way to pay these debts with its shattered economy. So it did what desperate debtors always do. It printed money. The printing presses at the Reichsbank ran day and night. At first it seemed to work. The government could pay its bills. Workers got their wages. But inflation began to creep upward. Bread cost more, rent cost more. Wages couldn't keep pace. By 1922, the mark was losing value by the week. By 1923, it was losing value by the hour. Here's where the monster revealed itself. Hyperinflation. In January 1923, $1 bought 18,000 marks. By November, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. Think about the scale of that. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Workers were paid twice a day because their morning wages would be worthless by afternoon. People carried money in wheelbarrows not because they were rich, but because paper currency had become lighter than the bread it bought. Life savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless. The middle class was wiped out. This was economic apocalypse. Families burned stacks of marks in their stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Prostitution exploded as desperate women sold their bodies for food. Suicides skyrocketed. The social fabric didn't just fray. It disintegrated. And here's the key. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a direct result of the debt trap built into the Versailles system. Germany couldn't pay in gold because it had none. It couldn't pay in goods because its industrial capacity was crippled. So it paid in worthless paper. Enter the antagonist, not a general, not a politician. The antagonist was the international bond market. French and Belgian creditors demanded payment. When Germany defaulted on coal deliveries in January 1923, France sent troops into the Ruhr Valley. This was Germany's industrial heart, the region that produced 80% of its coal and steel. French soldiers seized factories, mines, and railways. They operated them directly, shipping resources back to France as payment. This was liquidation. This was Germany being carved up and sold for parts. The German government called for passive resistance. Workers went on strike. Managers refused to cooperate. Trains stopped running. The Ruhr ground to a halt. Germany was trying to protect its assets by shutting them down. But strikes meant no production. No production meant no tax revenue. No revenue meant more printed money. The hyperinflation spiral accelerated into free fall. By autumn 1923, Germany was technically insolvent. The state couldn't function. Local governments issued their own currencies. Barter systems replaced money. The nation was fracturing. Then came the smoking gun moment. The Dawes Plan of 1924. An international committee led by American banker Charles Dawes restructured Germany's debt. Reparations were reduced and put on a payment schedule Germany could theoretically afford. American banks would lend Germany the money to make payments to France and Britain, who would then use that money to repay war debts to America. Read that again. It was a circular debt scheme. Germany was borrowing money to pay debts that were being recycled back to the original creditors. It was a Ponzi scheme with nations instead of investors. But it worked, sort of. American capital flooded into Germany. New factories rose. Unemployment dropped. Berlin became a glittering hub of art, science, and nightlife. The golden 20s arrived. German industry roared back to life. Production soared. Exports increased. For 5 years, it looked like Germany had escaped the trap, but the foundation was quicksand. The entire recovery rested on American loans. Those loans had to be repaid. Those repayments depended on continued economic growth, and that growth depended on continued American lending. It was a house of cards built on a cliff edge. October 1929, the Wall Street crash. American banks collapsed, credit froze worldwide, the loans to Germany stopped. Not slowed, stopped. German businesses that depended on American credit couldn't pay their workers. Factories closed. Unemployment exploded. By 1932, 6 million Germans were jobless. That's 1 in 3 workers. The economy contracted by 40%. Industrial production collapsed to 1913 levels. Hunger returned. Desperation returned. And with desperation came rage. Here's what the textbooks won't tell you clearly. The rise of extremism in Germany wasn't primarily about ideology. It was about insolvency. When people lose their savings, their jobs, their homes, they don't ask for policy papers. They ask for scapegoats and solutions. The moderate parties offered austerity, budget cuts, and painful adjustments. The extremists offered someone to blame and a promise to tear up the debt contract that was strangling the nation. One message was politically correct. The other was politically powerful. The Nazi Party's rise was financed by anger over Versailles, but it was fueled by economic collapse. Every campaign speech hammered the same points. The reparations were slavery. The international bankers were thieves. Germany was being bled dry by foreign creditors, and the people believed it because it was partly true. The Versailles system had created an impossible debt burden. The Dawes Plan had made Germany dependent on foreign capital. When that capital vanished, Germany's economy imploded. Sovereignty had been sold for loans, and now the bill was due. January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor. This wasn't a coup. This was an election result driven by economic catastrophe. The Nazi program promised to repudiate Versailles, stop reparations, and rebuild German economic independence. And they delivered, sort of. The new government stopped paying reparations in 1933. It launched massive public works programs. It rearmed the military in direct violation of Versailles. Unemployment dropped dramatically. Industrial production soared. For millions of Germans, it felt like liberation from economic bondage. But here's the hidden engine. None of this was sustainable. Germany wasn't rebuilding on solid finances. It was rebuilding on deficit spending, confiscated assets, and a system called MIFO bills. These were government-guaranteed promissory notes issued by a shell company. They allowed the government to spend without officially increasing the national debt. It was accounting fraud on a national scale. Germany was funding rearmament by printing money in disguise. The bill would come due. But not yet. By 1936, Germany was spending 10 billion Reichsmarks annually on the military. That was half the national budget. By 1938, it was 17 billion. The economy was being transformed into a war machine because war was the only way to make the numbers work. Germany needed resources it didn't have: oil, rubber, iron, food. It needed territory to exploit. It needed loot to balance the books. Expansion wasn't just ideology, it was economic necessity. The ledger demanded it. March 1938, the Anschluss. Austria was absorbed into Germany. This wasn't just territorial ambition. Austria had gold reserves worth 1.4 billion Reichsmarks. Germany seized them immediately. Austria had industrial capacity. Germany absorbed it. Every expansion brought resources, factories, and loot to feed the German war economy. It was profitable. That's the word nobody wants to use. Conquest was profitable. It paid for itself, and then some. September 1938, the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia was forced to hand over the Sudetenland. This region contained massive fortifications and critical industries. Germany gained the Skoda Works, one of Europe's largest arms manufacturers. It gained uranium mines. It gained defensive positions that made the rest of Czechoslovakia indefensible. When Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it seized 1.6 billion Reichsmarks in gold reserves and the entire Czechoslovak arsenal. Tanks, planes, rifles. Enough to equip multiple German divisions. Now look at the pattern. Every step of German expansion between 1936 and 1939 followed economic logic. The Rhineland was remilitarized because Germany couldn't defend its industrial core without it. Austria was absorbed for its gold and resources. Czechoslovakia was dismantled for its industries and strategic position. None of this was random aggression. It was systematic asset acquisition. Germany was rebuilding its balance sheet through conquest. And it worked until the math stopped adding up. Poland was different. Poland didn't just have resources. Poland was the key to the Eastern strategy. Beyond Poland lay the Soviet Union with its vast oil fields, grain production, and mineral wealth. Germany's economy was running on fumes by 1939. Oil reserves were critically low. Food stocks were tight. The Mayfo bills were coming due. The deficit was unsustainable. Germany faced a choice: contract the economy and face internal collapse, or expand the economy through conquest. The ledger demanded expansion. Here's the cold calculation. German military planners knew they couldn't win a long war. Germany didn't have the resources. But they believed they could win a series of short wars, seizing resources after each victory to fund the next campaign. Poland would provide food and labor. France would provide industrial capacity. The Soviet Union would provide oil and raw materials. Each conquest would pay for the next. It was economic imperialism with tanks and planes. August 23, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This was the ultimate pragmatic deal. Germany needed to neutralize the Eastern Front while it dealt with Poland and potentially France. The Soviet Union needed time to rebuild its military. Both sides agreed to carve up Eastern Europe. Secret protocols divided Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania into spheres of influence. This wasn't ideology. This was two powers making a temporary business arrangement. They would settle accounts later. September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a military tactic. It was an economic necessity. Germany couldn't afford a long war of attrition. It needed quick victories that consumed minimal resources while capturing enemy assets. The Polish campaign lasted 5 weeks. Germany seized Polish gold reserves, industrial equipment, and agricultural output. The occupation was designed to extract maximum resources with minimum cost. Poland was being liquidated. September 3, 1939. Britain and France declared war on Germany. This was the moment the regional debt crisis became a global conflict. Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence. When Germany invaded, they had to respond or lose all credibility. But here's the economic subtext. Britain and France were themselves financially exhausted from the First World War. They still owed massive debts to American banks. They couldn't afford another major war. But they couldn't afford to let Germany dominate Europe either. They were trapped. The war that followed was fundamentally about resources and solvency. Germany fought to seize the assets it needed to sustain its war economy. Britain fought to protect its empire and the trade routes that sustained its economy. The Soviet Union fought to survive and eventually to expand. The United States entered the war when it became clear that a German-dominated Europe would destroy the international economic order that American prosperity depended on. Every major decision was driven by the ledger. By 1945, Germany was destroyed. Its cities were rubble, its people starving, its economy obliterated. The final cost of the war was incalculable. 50 million dead, entire nations reduced to ash. And at the center of it all was a simple truth. Germany started the war because it went bankrupt after the First World War, and the leaders who came to power promised to restore economic sovereignty through conquest. The war was the bill coming due for Versailles. It was the price of an impossible debt burden. It was what happens when you try to solve insolvency through violence. Here's the aftermath. Germany was divided and occupied. It didn't regain full sovereignty until 1990. The final payment on First World War, reparations, was made on October 3, 2010, 92 years after the armistice. 3 generations of Germans lived under the shadow of that debt. The economic mistakes of 1919 poisoned Europe for a century. The Treaty of Versailles created the conditions for Hitler. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the middle class that could have resisted extremism. The Depression of 1929 provided the final push into catastrophe. This is the lesson they don't teach in school. Wars don't start because of evil men or bad ideas. Wars start because of bad debts, resource scarcity, and economic desperation. The ledger always comes first. The ideology is just the sales pitch. Germany didn't invade Poland because of racial theories. It invaded because it was broke and needed assets. The Holocaust wasn't caused by economics, but the war that enabled it was. Follow the money. Follow the gold. Follow the oil. That's where you find the real causes of history's darkest chapters. Sovereignty is solvency. Remember that phrase. A nation that cannot pay its debts is not truly independent. A nation that depends on foreign creditors is not truly sovereign. Germany learned this in the hardest way possible. It lost the First World War because the money ran out. It started the Second World War trying to rebuild its balance sheet through force. Both times the ledger was what mattered. Not the speeches, not the flags, not the propaganda, the ledger. If you want to understand history, stop listening to politicians. Start reading balance sheets. Stop watching parades. Start tracking gold reserves. Stop memorizing dates of battles. Start studying debt to GDP ratios and commodity prices. The accountants decide who wins. The bankers decide who fights. The market forces decide who survives. Everything else is theater. World War II was the most expensive bankruptcy proceeding in human history. 50 million people died because Europe couldn't balance its books after the First World War. So here's your real education. Subscribe to this channel. Stay ahead of the people who still think history is about kings and generals. Learn to read the economic signals that predict wars, revolutions, and collapses. Because the ledger never lies. Politicians lie, newspapers lie, propaganda lies. But the numbers tell the truth. Germany's gold reserves in 1939 told you war was coming. The oil imports told you where they'd strike first. The debt burden told you how it would end. If you know how to read the signs, history stops being mysterious. It becomes predictable. The dark truth behind how World War II started isn't complicated. Germany went broke. It tried to fix insolvency with printed money. That created hyperinflation. That destroyed the middle class. That created desperation. That brought extremists to power. They rebuilt the economy through deficit spending and rearmament. They needed resources to sustain that economy. They took those resources by force. The world responded. 50 million died. And the final bill wasn't paid until 2010. That's the story. No heroes, no villains, just debtors, creditors, and the bloody mathematics of national bankruptcy. Welcome to the real history. Welcome to the ledger.